What's yours is mine. What's mine is my own. That seems to be the logic of U.S. negotiators when it comes to the chips versus rare earth discussion. On Wednesday, a framework was reached in principle for implementing the consensus reached between the two presidents over a recent phone call and the trade deal reached last month in Geneva. That appears to be the outcome of the latest round of talks between the world's two largest economies in London so far. After 2 days of meetings, China's international trade representative, also Vice Minister of Commerce Liang Yan, said the two sides have conducted professional, rational, in-depth and candid exchanges. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick also talked about a trade framework and implementation plan agreed with China, according to media reports. Now, the $100 million question is whether the U.S. will stick to its commitments this time around. We know that immediately following the Geneva talks, the Trump administration moved to issue so-called guidance, warning the world against using certain Huawei chips. It then targeted China with more high-tech export controls and also threatened to aggressively revoke Chinese students' visas. In the last phone call, Chinese President Xi Jinping has used the metaphor of recalibrating the direction of the giant ship of China-U.S. relations, saying that the two sides should take the helm of the ship, set the right course, and steer clear of disturbances and disruptions as it sails forward. China is sincere and principled. Is the U.S. prepared to do the same? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Yuxi in southwest China's Yunnan province by David Blair, Vice President of the think tank Center for China and Globalization. From Boston by Professor John Quelch, Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan University. From Guangzhou in southern China's Guangdong province by Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, or CIIS. And from Portland, Oregon by Liang Yan, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University, also Senior Fellow at Global Development Policy Center of Boston University. Welcome to all of you. So let's talk about the outcome of the latest talks, the framework in principle. Now, China's Chief International Negotiator and also Vice Minister of Commerce Liang Yan said the two sides have in principle reached a framework for implementing the consensus reached by the two heads of state during the phone call on June the 5th and the consensus reached at the Geneva meeting. David, let me come to you. What could it mean by a framework in principle? What exactly does it contain?
As I understand it, it means that the senior leaders of both governments, the presidents of both governments, have not yet agreed in totality to the agreement. So the negotiators have reached an agreement, but the governments have not yet fully agreed. But I think it's important to remember this is a transitional agreement. We're seeing it's on what's a relatively short-term and relatively minor part of the total agreement, the total difficulties that will be facing trade and economics in general over the next decade. So I think we're seeing a short-term agreement to reduce the pain on both sides. The United States will allow some chips to come into China, and China will allow some rare earths to leave China toward the United States. But in the long term, both countries will be trying to deal with that domestically. The U.S. and other places will be developing new rare earth mines. And China, most importantly, will be developing, I think, a full azimuth chip producing capability. And so essentially, we're seeing a spread of that. But this is a bigger issue. I think we're going to see fundamental changes in the financial system over the next decade, because one, we're seeing the end of rules-based order. We're going to see more and more negotiations over issues like this, and I don't think we're going to see any move toward the more general rules-based order that we've lived with for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years.
Let me go to, let me go to, just hold on a minute. Let me go to the Chinese guest, Yang Xiyu, Mr. Yang Xiyu in Yunnan. How do you read the news? A framework in principle, or in the United States, a trade framework and implementation plan. What exactly is it about?
I think this framework is a sort of foundation, a complex foundation. On one hand, the two sides solve the immediate, urgent issues. For China, some high-tech trade restrictions, and for U.S. maybe more urgent, rare earth supplies. But on the other hand, this framework lay a base for the further, more difficult, more tough negotiations or bargaining for more complex issues. So basically, this framework play either as a stabilizer for de-escalating further the tensions between the two, give more confidence to the market. But on that hand, make a very significant but a small step for reduction of distrust by rare earth, by a deal between rare earth, some high-tech restrictions.
Professor Quelch, what is your take? The Chinese chief international trade representative talked about the talks being professional, rational, in-depth, and candid. What is your take of what they agreed upon in principle? And what are they going to do next? Are they going to continue talking? Are they going to, part their separate ways?
It's good news, and I hope they continue talking, and I'm glad that the discussions were as orderly as you have just described. One of the most important elements here is the presence of the Commerce Secretary in these negotiations. The Commerce Secretary was not present in Geneva. Export controls in the United States are under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Commerce. Tariffs are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Trade Representative. So what happened, I think, here was that in Geneva, there was a lot of talk about tariffs and some talk about rare earths and chips, but those export control issues were being discussed by the people who were not necessarily in charge of those issues. Now we have the Commerce Secretary coming out of the meeting, making the statement on behalf of the U.S. delegation, not the Treasury Secretary and not the U.S. Trade Representative. The Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, is a very good friend of the President for many, many decades. And when he says that there is an agreement in principle that he is going to be able to put before President Trump, I believe that that is significant.
Professor Liang Yan, what is your take? I mean, U.S. Trade Representative Besson told reporters in London that they had with the Chinese a good meeting, and Commerce Secretary Lutnick called the discussion fruitful. So is it like the other guests described, that China and the United States have come to some kind of arrangement as to how the United States will refrain or will step back from some of the export controls, especially concerning chips, while China will speed up its approval of rare earth export compliance licenses? Professor Liang Yan, we're not hearing you. Okay, let me give this question to David Blair. David, if you heard my question, you want to share with your comments?
Well, I think that we're moving toward a world where we need more and more and more negotiations. So I'm very happy to see that we've had senior people reach an agreement in principle. But this is the first of 10 years or 20 years of negotiations as we work out a new world trading order, which will largely be between the big three powers, between U.S., China, and the European Union. So I think there are difficult negotiations ahead.
Okay. Well, China's international trade representative, Mr. Li Chenggang, talked about the potential impact on the world. Let's listen to what he said coming out of the 2 days of talks in London.
It is hoped that progress made at the London meeting will be conducive to strengthening trust between China and the United States, to further promoting the steady and healthy development of economic and trade ties between the two countries, and to injecting positive energy to the development of the global economy.
David, we haven't heard the United States talking about, injecting positive or giving certainty to the world, but rather that their domestic concern about rare earth supplies from China may be resolved. How do you look at the contrast between what ostensibly is on the mind and lips of Chinese representative and what's on that of the United States?
Well, I think that's right. The U.S. sees this as a short-term negotiation dealing with rare earths and chips in particular, and it sees it as a step toward longer-term negotiations. But I think it's key to understand that the old trading system is pretty much done, partly because the U.S. has been running very huge trade deficits for decades. And that means the U.S. has been borrowing trillions of dollars over the decades. Nobody's going to keep lending trillions of dollars to the U.S. government over the next decades. So that's really over. So essentially, we have to move to a world where I think we're going to see more autarky over time as the U.S. and China and the EU develop relatively separate systems, less dependent on each other. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. For instance, in chips, I think China developing an all-azimuth chip system will be great. It brings more competition to the world. But really
is it realistic? I mean, in terms of high-tech products, okay, sorry for interrupting, probably they're going to be more homegrown technology here in China, as the United States doesn't want China to have access to its high-end product. But in terms of, day-to-day commodities, the all kinds of raw materials for manufacturing, are we going to see two systems as well? Or it's pretty much a reality of the day that, the two countries will continue to trade extensively and intensively?
I hope the two countries will continue to trade. Not only the two countries, but the whole world will continue to trade. There are a lot of benefits to trade. But the big problem is the financial system. The US dollar's role as the world currency is basically driven up the dollar. So it's not based on trade, it's based on financial flows. And so it's way overvalued. And that means a lot of people are lending money in the United States, and that won't continue forever. When it's going to end, I'm not sure, but it seems to be ending in this decade.
Okay.
So we're seeing fundamental changes in the financial system.
For sure.
I think trade.
Yeah, for sure. Mr. Yang Xiyu, what is China's logic, however, behind its export controls concerning rare earth? It started after the first trade war launched by President Trump against China. Now it significantly stepped up after so-called Revolution Day on April the 2nd this year, and China retaliated by putting on pretty aggressive export controls. What's the rationale behind China's measures in this regard?
Well, I think the regulation about rare earth export actually based on two aspects. On one hand, it's universal rules. Almost every country has export regulation systems, especially on the goods about the so-called dual-use goods. So that is one reason. Rare earths, most of the metal from the rare earths are dual-use goods. So we need to set up a regulation system. And on the other hand, with more and more exports about these products, we really need to increase the controls and the management for the order of the market, both for our domestic market and for the international market. So that is why China always repeated, they say such a regulation or export control does not target at any single country, but for the whole market rules. So I think it's a sort of a rules-based order.
What about non-proliferation? I'm going to stay with Mr. Yang because you are also an expert on security issues. China even talk about non-proliferation concerns when it's managing its rare earth exports, because rare earth, like chips, is for dual use as well. It can be used for civilian manufacturing, such as cars, but it can also be used for military purposes. According to the United States logic, if chips can be used for high-end weapons, so can rare earth elements.
Yes, it's a very good question. Actually, even without the trade war with the U.S. or with any country else, China has to increase the control of the rare earth export simply because of the besides the consideration I mentioned above, simply because of the risks of proliferation in wide range of areas, including from nuclear to the other mass destruction of weapons. So for our national security, for the international security, that is the must we have to do. That is the must. We have to take the responsibility.
Well, according to latest media reports, Professor Liang Yan, China actually was not dragging its feet. China did grant export licenses for exporters of rare earth elements, but the United States was repeatedly accusing China of breaking its promises made in Geneva. It seems that now that is clear, but in the future, after this round of agreement in terms of implementation going forward, how can the two sides make sure that, you know, they're getting the fair assessment of what the other side is doing, so that there's not so much mutual accusation, not so much finger pointing and muscling potentially?
Yeah, I think there are two separate questions. For one is, I think the current accusation of the United States, to me, is quite unfounded. We do see that the export volume of the rare earths in May to the United States has dropped by only 5.7%. And let's not forget, this month is really right after the Geneva Agreement was put in place. And so it does take some time for the normal licensing process to resume. So I think just looking at this 1 month of decline and accuse China not really implementing the agreements, I think that is groundless. Well, I think the problem is that, many of the US firms, they are really caught off guard of the Trump's policy and China's retaliation. They do not have stockpiles. We know that, MCHIM survey, 75% of firms said that they're going to run out of the rare earths, in 3 months' time. Now, the separate question that you asked, I think, is really about the enforcement. And unfortunately, right, I think, judging from the trade deal, phase one trade deal, there was no any sort of dispute settlement mechanism. Usually when you have trade dispute, you go to WTO, but we know the United States was the one that basically defunct the WTO's appellate body. So in that sense, there's really no third-party neutral arbitration process for this. And so I think that is why any agreement that can be reached could still be a very fragile agreement that the United States could walk back. So I think that is a problem.
Yeah, how are we going to solve this? Because right after I'm staying with Professor Liang Yan, right after the Geneva Agreement, what happened actually was the United States dished out a series of policies, as I mentioned, warning the world against using Huawei chips, although they recalibrated their wording a little bit, and then restricting exports of softwares concerning chip designs. They also decided to target Chinese students. How can we make sure that after this so-called framework, the United States is not going to do the same thing?
Well, unfortunately, I think the U.S. credibility at this point is very low. And I think, if you look at the longer trend, China does control about 90% of the processing of of rare earths, but it never really kind of weaponized or abused it. The last time they used it is 7 weeks ban or restrictions towards Japan back in 2010. And the global trading system of the rare earths have been really normalized. But this time around, I think, it's inevitable that as long as Trump is in office, I think there's still possibility that somehow these trade agreements will not be respected. I mean, he was the one who penciled in the USMCA back in his first term, and 4 years later, he basically reneged on it. So I think the track record of Trump administration, unfortunately, was not glowing. And so you're right. I think there's a lot of, I think still concerns about how well these trade agreements may be enforced. And let's not forget, this is really a trade framework. There's no dispute settlement mechanisms. There's no enforcement mechanisms. And so, yes, everything is still kind of up in the air and it's open-ended.
What I don't understand, what really makes me very curious, is that the United States sees China wielding this rare earth card, right? Whether or not China is doing it is one thing, but the United States definitely sees China using this rare earth card. But it's the United States that kind of cornered China into going to extreme measures by launching these tariff war, by launching the second round of trade war. Did the U.S., David, did the U.S. think it can restrict China's access to chips but continue to have access to China's rare earth?
I think this is part of a general trend. The U.S. has overplayed its hand in a lot of cases. For instance, use of the dollar as a weapon, that's very much overplaying its hand. I think it's also overplayed its hand in this case. So I don't think there's anything unusual going on here. It seems like part of a trend. I also think there's not a lot of constituency in the United States for changing this. You see a lot of anti-Chinese propaganda. I think, let me say, I think the U.S. economy has a lot of problems. Working class Americans have really suffered over the last 40 years. But I think that has nothing to do with China, almost nothing to do with China. It's because of big changes in the financial system. It's our inability to enforce antitrust law, but it's easier to blame it on foreigners than it is to blame it on domestic policies. So I'm hoping it changes in the domestic policies, but I'm not so optimistic about that.
Professor Quelch, what is your take? You have been listening to the other guests, especially going forward, because U.S. Commerce Secretary Mr. Lutnick said when China approves the licenses, meaning licenses of exporting rare earth, then you should expect that the U.S. export implementation will come down as well, meaning the various additional restrictions they put on China. It seems that the U.S. maintains that it's the victim and China should take the first step. Are we going to see more mutual accusation, more finger pointing in the immediate future?
Well, I hope not, because it's not productive, and it's not sensible to say you have to go first and then I decide whether or not I'm going to uphold my part of the bargain. Both parts of any transaction, any deal, have to be implemented simultaneously for a fair and trust-building exchange to occur. I do think that dependency in general, as has been indicated previously, dependency in general is a risk for any company or any country in this kind of situation. And so reduction in dependency is one way of reducing the prospects for there to be confrontation. And so the U.S. will no doubt be investing in developing its own rare earth processing capacity. Obviously, China controls 80% of refining capacity in rare earths at the moment, but there's a tremendous amount of rare earth capacity under the ground in Alaska and so forth. And over time, no doubt, the U.S. will also be investing in material science technology that will try and develop new approaches to developing materials that aren't dependent upon rare earths that it does not have good supply of. So this is the natural set of strategies that any company or any country will follow when it's in a situation where there's excess dependency. But in the short term, I think that we are seeing, if Mr. Lutnick is to be believed, we are seeing progress. And I'm pretty confident that, as I said earlier, that if he has given a little bit of a boost to this deal coming out of the meeting, that he's going to have the ear of the president, and hopefully there will be an agreement on both sides that will be implemented simultaneously rather than someone attempting to do it sequentially.
Mr. Yang Xiyu, what is your take of what's going to happen next over the next few days? I mean, China is pretty patient given what the United States has done and said. A lot of nasty things said about China, about Chinese students, and yet China seems to remain committed. I mean, especially the two presidents. According to the Chinese readout, at least, China extended an invitation for a visit to the U.S. counterpart. What does that say about China's fundamental stance on this issue with regard to U.S.-China relations?
Well, I think let me put it this way. I have been surprised by the second time. First time is the Geneva talks, and secondly for the London talk. From my past experiences, I used to be involved quite several bilateral negotiations between China and the U.S., but I never seen. I can not imagine in such a 2-day short time the two sides can reach such a substantive results, both in Geneva and London. It's unthinkable before. So what's behind that? I think the most important for this achievement of framework or the joint statement in Geneva reflects the very unique and firm determinations from both of the capitals that both China and the U.S. Has determined to manage the issue in positive, constructive way rather than confrontational way. So this is very important, more important than a concrete content of the agreement framework, because that is the base. The leadership's determination lay a framework for the further negotiations, although the following negotiation will be very difficult. Roughly speaking, we will have a tougher trade negotiations about tariffs.
Okay, we don't hear Mr. Yang Xiyu, unfortunately. Professor Liang Yan, I give you the opportunity to wrap up, if you will. Has it been a surprise to you that looking at the tremendous complexity and scale of stakes involved, the two sides, meaning the United States and China, actually have been able to reach some kind of agreement rather quickly?
Well, I think yes and no. I think it is a relatively quick deal in the sense that I think the U.S.
Okay. David, let me call on you. David, help us out here. David?
I'm glad to see this.
Sorry.
Because it means that the two sides are talking. As I've said before, I think there are going to be a lot of negotiations going forward, and the more we talk and the more we trust but verify each other, the better off we will be. I really hope it doesn't develop into hostility. I hate the term trade wars because they diminish the meaning of the word war. Anything that led to military conflict between the two countries would be horrible beyond belief.
Yeah.
And working out a modus operandi and a mode of living together is crucial.
Yeah. Professor Quelch, I give you 20 seconds, your words as we conclude the show.
Well, I'm always very optimistic, and I think despite the ups and downs and the turmoil of the last 100+ days, that the forces for stability in terms of commercial interest will eventually prevail, and that during the course of the next 2 months before we reach the August deadline, that we will see a further ratcheting down of tensions and some movement not just on export controls but also on tariffs and non-tariff barriers as well. So I'm very encouraged, and I hope that everybody will get back on track using the latest announcement as a motivation for doing so.
We have to leave it there. We don't like it, many of the things we don't like it, but we have a responsibility to the world. Many thanks to my guests, David Blair, John Quelch, Yang Xiyu, and Liang Yan. With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point, coming to you live from Beijing. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Lixin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.